What's going on, guys? It's your boy Beatsbyash, back at it again with another episode of the Table 1 podcast. And today, we're in Loading TCG's basement. He finally was able to close the door on me. And so, unfortunately, I'm going to be stuck in here talking to you guys about OP05. How are you doing today, Mike?
Dude, I'm doing good. How about you?
Doing pretty good. Excited to get back into the game. You know, I'm locking in a regional, getting first place with Purple Luffy. And then in February, I'm getting first place at the Magic Con in Chicago. So, you know, my card game career is just loading back up, one would say, as we are in the Loading TCG headquarters.
I like that transition. That was smooth, man. That was smooth, yeah.
Yes, sir. There's a lot of exciting things about OP05. There are drastic changes coming to the game that are kind of pulling me back in. Now, I feel like we've both kind of felt a similar way, and I feel like the general population of the game, while we've still been seeing some decent growth, you know, as the game has progressed, I think that some of that growth has become more stagnant starting in OP03, but especially OP04 and 100% after, you know, the wacky ban list and stuff, just because I personally didn't play a lot in OP04 because I didn't feel that it really changed the game a lot. And when you're going to play a card game when sets come out very slowly and the meta is going to be the same for 3 months without introducing any new cards, you want to have drastic changes, especially in the beginning portions of the game's infancy where there's not as many cards to pull from, right?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. I had a lot of high hopes for OP4, and I was severely let down because I thought Purple Dofi was going to be much more impactful than it was. And we were still just like, it basically just playing OP2 again and again and again for like 9 months. It felt like it was just like you had other rogue decks you could play, and that was about it.
100%. And I think one of the biggest downfalls of OP04 would be that the new decks that were introduced, I would kind of classify OP4, OP5 as almost like a two-part set. Because we got, you know, the Grape Doflamingo stuff in set 4. And I was also very excited for that. I had high hopes for the deck as a whole after seeing how unfair the 10 cost Doflamingo is on paper. I thought that would be a powerhouse. But considering that half of the support and arguably the better end of that support comes in OP05, it kind of felt like we should have already had access to those cards, such as the Searcher, such as Birdcage, you know, because I've been seeing people play those a lot since I've been getting back on the sim. And it almost just feels like when I'm going against that deck, how did the deck function without that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, they weren't playing the Don Quixote package. They were playing the film package because, like, other than the 10-drop Dofi, like, all the other Dofi cards, like, that leader got in OP4 just weren't impactful. You know, they were just kind of weird, and the synergy was weird, and they wanted you to keep a lot of Don up while playing characters, and it just didn't really work that well.
That's true. And it's like, I think one of the things that kind of shadowed over the game was the red decks, specifically just decks that could utilize the 5-cost Marco, since it was so overstated for its time and it's still such a high value character in the game. You need to introduce like cards that are going to be on the same level as that card. And the fact there were so many ways to consistently access that card, it felt like the Don Quixote pirate support failed in comparison, because you have something like the 10-drop Doflamingo and you just can't access it. So while this card is on the same power level as a portion of the Whitebeard Pirates cards, they're almost guaranteed to see those cards every game. And Don Quixote Doflamingo almost feels like the times it's at its best and its most oppressive is when you could chain them back to back like you can with Big Mom. Yeah. And at that point, if that's my goal, why would I not just play the Big Mom deck when I essentially have 2 searchers to access that card, right?
Yeah, I think the problem with Katakuri decks is not that they don't see a Big Mom, is that they see too many Big Moms in hand and they just don't have the time to play them all because they get clumped up. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And especially with like the thing with Zoro and Whitebeard, why they're so good is because they're just so consistent. Like Zoro plays 12 searchers. Whitebeard plays all these vanillas, all these 2Ks. Like those decks kind of just do one thing really well, Whereas like other decks kind of frantic for the other stuff.
And it just so happens that one thing has been the best thing to do for a very long period of time. Consistency is really weird in this game because I've said it before, I'll say it again. In set 1, when I started off playing blue decks and I would go against someone playing Jewelry Bonnie, it felt like they were playing a different game. And after I touched a deck with Jewelry Bonnie, it was like, how can I play a deck without Jewelry Bonnie at that time? And as we went forward, that really transformed into, how can I play a deck other than my Zoro deck that has access to 16 searchers?
Yeah, it is like polarizing. Playing another things, you get, it's like you're tired of eating the same thing over and over. Like, oh, this seems good, And then you play that thing again, you're like, it doesn't have a searcher. I don't know if I can play this. I get that mentality. It's rough. That's why I liked Kid so much in the beginning. One Piece a year ago is because you had Momo and you had Bonnie, which a lot of people would cut Momo because they're like, I just don't have enough to. But I'm like, they were just searchers that you could use over and over again. So it's just like, why wouldn't you? It was just the most consistent deck at that time too.
100%. I mean, especially that's, what we would consider an infinite value searcher, where it's like, if the guy doesn't answer it, even if you only get one search, I mean, he still has to attack it on board. Whereas something equivalent to that, like if you had a Nami and there wasn't as many targets as there are actually in the game, like let's say there was an equivalent amount to Momonosuke, then that would be a different story. But the fact that you can continuously accrue value, it was just a game changer. And that's what's so interesting going into OP05, because I personally didn't believe that we could ever revert back to a point where you didn't need to have minimum 8 to 16 searchers in your deck. And we've seen in Asia that that's just not the case. Some of the decks that we're going to talk about today either require 0 searchers, or something like Sakazuki has a searcher and it only looks at 3 cards,
Yeah, I think part of the reason with that is just like Sakazuki's such a good leader because you don't need that many searchers because you're hand filtering every turn. It's where like your opponent's going to see like 1, maybe 2 cards. Sakazuki sees 2 cards every turn, because they have to discard, but it also feeds into some of the other cards in the deck. And I think that's just like the leaders in this set are just really strong.
100%. That's actually what I was about to get into. I think a big turning point for this set in the game is that up until set 5, your powerful decks were leaning on searchers to find the most powerful cards in the game. And now we're finding that the best way to go about the game is to utilize these leaders we're receiving in OP05, which present a higher power level than the sum of the deck's parts, right? Like, and that's such a crazy thing to think about, because without this power creep on the leader end, I don't think any of these decks that we're about to talk about would be able to function on the same level of success.
I would agree with that. The thing about Whitebeard too is like what I was saying with Sakazuki is like people don't realize is you were seeing 2 cards a turn with that deck. The thing with Zoro that made it really good is like 1 Dawn is essentially 5 Dawn, with the way you like how you attach it and stuff like that. And so I think that's why those decks shine so much. And in like another point, Law, you could bounce searchers. So you would see a lot more cards with those decks, So just seeing cards, filtering cards, there's like there's two different battles in this game. I feel like there's the battle, there's like the field, and then there's the hand battle. Who has better cards in their hand, who has more cards in their hand. Like, that's a big component of this game that I think isn't as big in other games.
Exactly. And, Law was really the deck that stood out to me to really demonstrate what kind of advantage you need to be presenting to utilize a leader that is starting with less than 5 life, right? And it's like, I've said this so many times that the reason why Law was good is because you're starting with not just 1 less life, but you're going to see 1 less card than the other person. But if you're able to use your leader ability to generate you 2 additional searches, then you have now made up for that 1 less card being seen. And every time you do it from that point onward, you're adding additional separation between the amount of cards that you should have seen versus they would have seen. And now, like, going into set 5, I think a lot of people have been making this distinction. I saw a Twitter post from a guy a while ago who was saying he thinks going forward in the game that we're going to be at a point soon where 2-color leaders are going to be like power creeping out all of the monocolor leaders. And it made a lot of sense. And, Sakazuki is definitely, breaching the gap on that, because other than Law, that's really the only deck that I think currently provides enough value to bypass that gap of starting with 1 less card. And they've actually kind of increased the power level of what a mono leader is presenting. And I think that's kind of interesting, because I just thought that the game was going to go down this path where the multicolor leaders were going to be the way to go.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I saw the game come out and I saw that, I was like, okay, that's how they're balancing these multicolor leaders. You get 1 less life, but you get access to a whole nother card pool. Sometimes the effects can just be much better because you're starting at 1 life. And it's just like, naturally, if you've looked at a bunch of TCGs and stuff, you're like, well, of course it's going to go that route, right? And yeah, it's more, in the beginning, it was like the mono leaders were so good, like kind of how you're saying, like they're going to have to be so good versus the multicolor leaders. And now it's just kind of starting to flip-flop.
Yeah. So going over the set, instead of just doing a card-by-card review, we're kind of just going to talk about each of the decks that we feel are either winners of this new card pool or new strategies in the game that are decently relevant, rather than talking about each individual filler card, because we want to be giving you guys the most value as possible without taking up an immense amount of time. So I've gathered some deck lists here that are from the decks that we kind of feel like are ones that are going to make a considerable impact in the game. And we're going to talk about what those decks are trying to do, maybe some of the merits of those decks at face value. And as well, we're going to go over some of like the key role players in each of those strategies and why they make that strategy viable. We're going to go ahead and start off with Balo Betty. Balo Betty is a red-yellow leader, which starts with 4 life, and her ability is once per turn, you can discard a Revolutionary Army type card to give 3 Revolutionary or Trigger type characters plus 3,000 power this turn. And whenever I first saw this card before any of the other cards were revealed, I think a lot of other people really anticipated that this was going to be a game-breaking leader. This seems like, on paper, a very overpowered card in general, and it almost feels like, if you don't know anything about what the cards bring and what the other decks are, that this is just going to blow everything out of the water, and that the 1 life disadvantage really doesn't matter. Because essentially, I'm discarding 1 card to hopefully generate 9,000 power on the board. And to me, if you showed me this card and I didn't know what any of the other cards did, I would say that you should have to attach a Dawn at least one, maybe two, to get this kind of effect, because that seems downright crazy, right?
Yeah, I mean, this card reminds me a lot of the Film Shanks, because I think he's put back 2, and then you give all your film characters plus 2 or 3,000. It's something like that, something crazy. But like his problem was you had to put Dawn back, and like you had to have a field of film characters that were purple, and there was only ones that came in the deck. So you were just so limited to that deck. But like Bello Betty, already has a Revolutionary Searcher that's like Nami and all of them. And if you're taking hits early game because you're an aggro deck, you'll probably take that first hit or two, hopefully get a trigger. And then like, oh, look, I just played things because you hit me. I think that's, and you also get access to 2 card pools. I think it's a good leader for sure.
I think that this leader, out of the ones we're going to discuss, has the most potential for you to mess around with in terms of changes to making the correct list the most optimal way to play the deck. I don't think is currently solved, which is something that we haven't really said in this game too much. One might say the goo. And I think that for the most part, it can be said that generally speaking, the Revolutionary Pirates cards we got were a hit. Some of these archetypes we've got, like, for example, RIP, the new Baroque Works support. It's like, even if that support was actually statted fairly, it still wouldn't be tier 0, probably not even tier 1 by any means. And I think that's happened with quite a few strategies we've got in the game. I mean, the Shanks film archetype is a good example of that. But for the most part, these Revolutionary Pirates cards are very well statted. I think very fair in terms of their power level to the other cards we got in this set, which is something we haven't always seen in the other sets. Like the Baroque Works cards in set 4, I don't think were statted on the same level as even the Don Quixote Pirates cards that didn't even end up being that good, right? Like, those are just on 2 different levels. I'm paying 5 for a no counter Miss All Sunday that has 5,000 power. And then also the Don Quixote Pirates, they have the Diamante, which gets a counter. He gets the Marco treatment. He's also 6,000. And it's like, I just don't think that that's a good way to approach the game, where in a set, you're going to have archetypes that are on different intervals, right?
Yeah. And Miss All Sunday, she could have had another 1K somewhere, whether it be counter or like a 6K. It still probably wouldn't have changed. If it would have had a 1K counter, it would have changed that card a lot. If Purple Luffy would probably run that card, but since it doesn't, like you're saying, it's just like, it's just so understated compared. Because the way I kind of view cards is, you're saying like the Marco test. And what I always look at is like, there's a 2K gap somewhere. Like all vanillas, their cost is 2 less than their stats. So when I see a card like Marco, I'm like, you took that 1K and you put it on, like, you put it as like the counter, or you put it in the effect. So there's like there's this threshold where you're doing that. Missile Sunday, if you applied the same thing where you took her effect and made that into her power, she would be a 5/6 with no counter. So it's just like the design of that card is just really bad.
True. And it goes to show that, in set 4, when they're going to have these other cards on a higher power level, it shows that they were willing to extend the power creep to a higher level in that set. And they chose to make that set of cards like unfairly statted in comparison. It's just kind of, lazy game designing. But I don't think that is the case in this set. And I think that's one of the most attractive features to me. So in general, I think you brought up the point that one of the reasons you would want to play this deck is because it's apparently good against Sakazuki. You are looking to play a wide game, not a tall game. And the key theme here is 7 power matters, which equates very well to our leader ability, because anyone who is 4,000 power or 5,000 power is going to meet that criteria, which is most of the cards that are in the deck. Some of the most notable cards in the deck are starting off is the 3-cost 4K Sabo, which is a gacha game exclusive. I currently do not know when this is going to be released to us, but I have a strong feeling that this card is going to make the deck find quite a bit of more potential or a higher ceiling to its success when we get this. This card is a 3-cost 4,000 power with Dawn 1X. If you have 4 or less cards in hand, this card gets 2,000 power. Now, this card also has a counter, and it's doing a lot of things for the deck. The key focal point here is 7,000 power matters. Typically, it's not going to be difficult for you to get down to 4 or less cards because our leader allows us to discard a card for free. So that is not really a restriction. Basically, just read this card as attach 1 Dawn. This card gets plus 3,000 power instead of 1,000. And when you put it like that, this card is a very strong card because at the same time, this ability is not only for your turn, it is as well during your opponent's turn. And to me, that is a big deal because it means we're going to be able to attack them and demand 2 cards on our turn. And then if they want to attack it on their turn, they're also going to be taxed. So this card is just all of things you want to have in terms of efficiency. And I think it's going to be a big role player in the deck. Moving forward, we have Inazuma. This is just another 3-cost 4K that gains Rush if you have a 7,000 power character. Like Mike noted, that you are trying to play a wide game, and against Sakazuki, that's what you want to be doing. I think this card is very integral to the strategy because it allows you to pressure the other player even after they used a devastating effect, such as the new 4-cost Rob Luchi, because you're not always going to be able to keep all your characters on board. So being able to put this on the field for 3 and then use our leader ability and attack without making any Dawn investment, and as well hidden for 7, demanding 2 cards from them, I think that just does a lot for the deck.
Yeah.
We also have Emporio Ivankov, a 4-cost 5K, once per turn. If this has 7,000 or more power, play a 5,000 power character that is revolutionary type from your hand. I think this is probably the cornerstone of the deck. You want to be playing a wide game. This card allows us to develop 2 bodies for 4 power, and this card is always going to be live. I think the way that you should read these cards is don't read the top line of text on any card that has a requirement of 7,000 power to be live, because that is always going to be live. And whenever you look at the cards with that set of glasses, I think it makes the cards seem a lot better on paper. And I think that's a good way to determine if this card is worthy of including in your deck, if its effect is relevant while you have a 7,000 power character, then it's probably a good inclusion in the deck, in my mind. But I think that card just does a lot of things for your deck, because one big thing about the way you want to play this strategy, in order to get the most value out of our leader every turn, we need to put 3 guys on the board. I don't think you want to be using this ability, preferably if you have only 2 people, and probably not if you only have 1 person, unless it's just a simplified game state, just because discarding a card in this game is very crucial. Up until set 3, I had talked to many people where people told me, they said Jet Pistol was a very good card because in this game, in its infancy, 1-for-1 trades were really, really powerful. And so when you think about what losing a card costs in this game, I think it has a higher weight than we've seen in other previous TCGs. And so that's just something to keep an eye out for when you're evaluating these cards. The next one we have is the 4-cost 5K Karasu.
Sure.
Yeah, that worked. Birdman. Birdman says if your leader is Belo Betty, give one leader or character minus 1k this turn. Disregard the part where it says character because you're just going to target their leader every time. I mean, when I saw this card, I thought this card broke the game. The second effect of this card is that if you have 7,000 or more power, give one of your opponent's leaders or characters minus 1,000 this turn. So the exact same effect on attack without attaching any Dawn. The reason I thought this card was game breaking, it was actually a mistranslation on first reveal. We thought that you didn't have to have a 7,000 power character to get the effect on attack, which in my mind made Zoro tier 0 because then all of your 3,000 power 1-cost bodies required no Dawn investment to hit their 4,000 power leader. When that is not the case, I think this card is still very exceptional in the deck, but it definitely does put a lower value on it to me, especially in this deck where you can basically only use this card in the deck. The effect kind of has a little less relevance than I originally thought, because if we're making all of our guys 7,000 power anyway, how much weight does giving their leader 4,000 power this turn really hold? Do you have any thoughts about this?
I mean, so if we're making it 4,000, we're trying to get our characters to 7,000. That's demanding 3 cards out of hand, assuming 2 of them are 2Ks. And if we're doing 7,000 at their 5, that's demanding, 2 2Ks. So it can demand another card. I mean, it's situational. If you get 2 of these guys out, then that's really relevant. But one, I think can be kind of impactful because you can cheat it out with Ivankov. Like say you have 3 characters, you Belo Betty, Ivankov goes to this, and you slam this down, and then all of a sudden, like, you're demanding, one more card for each of your body. So I think it can be pretty impactful, when you use it. And if it stays around, I would just assume that it's just going to get the on play. Because if you're playing against your opponent, they're probably going to go after this first,
That's very true. What we can say about this card is it demands an immediate answer. And if the removal was not as premium in this set, I think that this card would hold a higher weight in my mind. But just like you're saying, I feel like when you already have 3 guys on the board and you're maximizing your leader, the ability is a little bit win more in some ways.
Yeah.
But I guess you kind of see it like this. If you're giving their leader minus 1k this turn, and you are able to attack with 3 people under your leader ability, maybe that pays for the tax that you had to pay for your leader ability, since minus 1,000 power on 3 separate attacks is most likely going to get you minimum 1 additional card, hopefully 2. And in that regard, you didn't actually have to discard a card for your leader, which is a good thing to have. And at the end of the day, this card does have a counter. Yeah. I think the biggest implication here, like you're saying, is going to be when you go Ivankov and cheat this out, and maybe you can't attack with any characters the turn you play this card, but you just want to develop bodies.
Yeah. And
that way, you can tap out all of your Dawn the turn you play this and still attack with your leader without having to attach it on. I think that's the biggest hit for me, is like that turn where you aren't able to use the leader ability, I still get to attack with my leader without attaching because I'm tapping out.
Another thing is, I'm thinking about this some more now that I'm reading the card. Luffy does have Kid, so if he goes to 6, then you're knocking it back down to a 5. So you will get to swing with your leader, where otherwise you might not be able to. Also, like, it allows you to play a character on 4 and swing at something like Whitebeard or Red Purple Luffy with a free swing with your leader. So I think against some decks, he's definitely better.
That's a good point. It's definitely a card that when you put it in that regard, you want to mulligan for it in certain matchups, because I can definitely see the implications from where you're coming from. And I assume that the Purple Luffy deck is probably one of the more difficult matchups for that reason.
Yeah.
Of, you're trying to play a wide game and it's like, if they're buffing up their leader multiple times with a kid, then you are not going to get as much value from your leader ability, and they can kind of like 2-for-1 you with big bodies. So that's where you might want to mulligan for this card in that matchup. But other than that, we've got a couple more. Koala, 2 cost, 3,000 power. This is the 2K of the deck. To me, this is one of the big standouts of the deck because we have seen a history of 2K counters outside of red being cards that more often than not, it's only a 2K counter. And that was one of my main reasons for playing Zoro so much, is that all of the 2Ks I used, I had an equal or higher justification to want to put that card on board than I did just to keep it in hand. And that's exactly what this card does. So on play, if your leader is Velo Betty, give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 3,000 power this turn. Now, that goes very well in conjunction with our next card, Lindbergh. 4 cost 5K. If this character has 7,000 or more power, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 3,000 or less on attacking. With a trigger, if your leader is multicolored, you may discard a card and play this card. So the standard Katakuri treatment. Now, I think when you read this card, it adds a higher weight to Koala because then there's going to be times where you reduce their 6,000 power kid blocker and now it's 3,000, and then you Lindbergh and you're just fucking the guy up. I mean,
yeah,
I think this card has a lot of combo potential, and I actually am a big fan of the design of Koala. I think it's very unfair to have 2Ks such as Brook or Makino, which are just universally cards you want to play on the board and you're happy to play them on the board in most of the decks that actually have red in their color identity, versus these other decks where it's like, even in Purple Luffy, don't try to tell me that you're going to put one of these 2Ks on the board or it has another purpose.
The only 2K you should be playing is probably ulti
to
cheat out page 1. And like even certain matchups, you don't want to do that because you don't want to like go too wide and then just dump your hand.
100%. And that's why I love the design on this card, because it is a card that has utility to be played on the board, but it is also specific to what other cards you have in conjunction to it. And so I feel like it's a fair justification to give this deck a 2K that actually has an on-field effect compared to the blankets that everyone else has.
Yeah. I will say I'm glad she's restricted to Revolutionary, but I wish you could play it in Ace.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome. Also, I will mention there is a searcher for this deck, standard Nami searcher. Look at the top 5. That's exactly what you want in any new archetype with a limited card pool. And I think that the searcher has a lot of weight in this archetype just because the overall average card quality of this type is very, very high. And when I played the Zoro deck, the weakest searcher was Nami. And it's like I was more playing that card just to have an additional searcher. But if I had to cut one, it would be that one, because the average card I was searching really was not that powerful in comparison to something like an Izo. Whereas I feel like Velo Betty is on level with something like an Izo in terms of like what you're getting. You're not playing this card as a searcher just to get one specific card. On average, most of the cards you're going to see, you are going to be happy, and it's going to create a lot of optionality for the deck, because it's one thing to just search and, okay, this is the only target. This is the only relevant one. The other card I could add is a 2K, versus creating more decisions to be made in the game, because there's a lot of like micro decisions with this deck and how the cards interact. So I'm super glad they got one of those. There's actually one other new card, which is the revolutionary version of Fire Fist. 2 cost event, main, give one opponent's character minus 4,000 power. And if you have 2 or less life, you can also KO one character with 0 or less power. And trigger, you can activate the effect I think this card is very fair, and I like that it works in conjunction with the other cards once again, adding more value to your koala. You can technically kill something of up to 7,000 power or less. And when you think about mana efficiency, Jet Pistol, you paid 4 to kill something 6 or less. And in conjunction with Koala, you can spend the same amount of mana to kill something 7 or less, which is an area or an interval that we haven't had access to interact with at this cost yet. So I think that's super awesome addition to add to this game. And I will note that this is not locked behind Revolutionary Pirates, so you can definitely put this in your Zoro decks, in your Ace deck, and I'm sure it's going to be something that we will be seeing in the future.
I know a lot of Zoro decks are playing that. And speaking on that card, there's a lot of versatility because whatever you're getting -4 to, you don't have to pop that. So if they have something like Rebecca that's already 0 power, and say they have a tapped Kuzan, well, you're going -4 on the Kuzan, pop the Rebecca that was going to save it, and now I'm just going to get that 2-for-1 in Sakazuki, the Sakazuki player.
Very good point. I didn't think about it in that light. That's the goo right there. I mean, you're just adding layers to this card, and it's definitely a nice addition. I kind of wish that it was locked into Revolutionary Pirates because red doesn't need more versatile ways to like KO your stuff.
No, it does not.
Now, going into what I think is holding this deck back is the fact that it's yellow. Even though the Revolutionary Pirate cards are all amazing, I don't think there's really any reason for this deck to be yellow. Similarly to Yellow Purple Croc, there was also no reason for that deck to be yellow. I don't understand why they make these new decks that are a specific archetype. You know, it's centered around like a key character type, but then we're going to make it 2 colors, and one of the colors has no portion of cards in that color. I don't know how they think that that's going to be set up for success, right? You know, you think about why the new Sakazuki is good. Well, one of the focal points of that is that there are good navy cards in blue and black, which has not been the case for any of these other 2-color leaders. And I think that's really what has hurt it. So I guess people are playing cards like Katakuri and like, you know, the Sanji blocker, other triggers like that. But in general, it's like, what synergy do those cards really have with this deck, right?
Yellow feels like the only child color of One Piece. Like all the other colors kind of can blend together, but like yellow just does yellow shit. And it's like putting other stuff to it, like usually doesn't add that much value, or putting it in something doesn't add much value. Like Bello Betty. You have a few things, but like one of the lists we're looking at right now just has a splash of yellow, you know? It's not like a true 50-50. You're running the triggers, you're running Katakuri, you know, probably just because you can, or Katakuri is probably like a late game to try and like have some kind of late game and not just die.
Exactly. And it's like, this is supposed to be an aggressive deck, and the only reason Katakuri is in the deck, I'm assuming, is because it's just one of the highest power level yellow cards. But in general, I don't think that this card aligns with the game plan of this deck. And as well, the yellow cards, the only thing they actually have in common with Bello Betty is that your 2K counters that I mentioned normally have a blanket effect. If you pick the ones that also have trigger, I guess you're adding additional optionality to that. But at the same time, do you always want to be discarding a 2K off Bello Betty's effect? I think more often than not, you would prefer to discard a 1K or something with no counter. But that is one of the things that I do see with this deck that is nice, is it seems like in general, you are running a minimum amount of cards that have no counter, or at least you have the option to. And that's always something I'm looking to do in this game because I don't hold a very high weight on 2K counters in general. And so I want to play as few non-counter cards in my deck as I can.
Yeah, and I think this is one deck that leans towards that, is because it's kind of like your early cards matter so much more than like I can just hold my hand and play the late game. It's no, I have to play all my stuff out early, and I don't want to just play it out, not have any counters, and just be caught with my pants down,
100%. Overall, I think this deck is probably going to be positioned tier 2. I mean, I'll just make that assumption now until we get access to that Treasure Cruise Gotcha Sabo. I just don't really see a lot of merits to playing the deck, but I do think that if we see Sakazuki have high representation and you want to make a meta call, there's going to be some potential there. So definitely keep a lookout on it, and let us know if you guys got any spicy brews, because it's definitely one that I am more interested in messing around with. Moving on to our next deck we're going to be talking about is the Sakazuki. At the time of this recording, I would regard this as being probably the best deck in the Asia meta, just because people didn't really solve the deck until Mike said about halfway through, and still the deck is very close to being the leader with the most amount of premier event tops out of any of the decks available in OP05, and I feel like if people had put more time into this deck in the beginning, that it might have more tops than the front runner, which is Purple Luffy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm really excited about this leader because I like slower leaders that are a little more interactive versus, Luffy's really good, and like you've been sitting, because we've been talking a little before this, but you talking about the micro decisions like that. I feel like you have a lot of micro decisions with Sakazuki. It's not as straightforward as just play Rob Luchi and kill things, but they've kind of had to build on that and figure out, solve this deck, put more effort into solving it at least than some of the other decks in this meta.
100%. And I will say, this leader is exactly what I was looking for in this game, as we talked about in the last episode. What they're doing with the power creep, where they're not adding additional complexity to the gameplay, is something that neither of us are very excited about. And so this leader kind of feels like it's for the people that wanted more depth in the gameplay. If you don't know what this card does, once per turn, you can discard a card, draw a card for free, which is amazing. And as well, on attack, you can give someone -1 cost for free as well. And I think this card is really pushing the boundaries on what previous leaders were able to do. And I think it's a no-brainer why you're able to get away with having 4 life. I always like to say, more options create more opportunities to win the game, which is something I am always a fan of. Who needs searchers when you can just cycle every turn? And one of the big caveats we had with black previously is every card is just a -2 or a -3 in card advantage. And really, what this deck does to bring black out of the shadows is the new cards that we got, and there are quite a few of them. All of the good ones do not require you to discard any cards, so you are no longer losing card advantage. And as well, you also have a free way to put things into the trash, which previously, using the CP package to utilize the more powerful cards, you had to set up before actually getting value from them, which that is no longer the case. And the other side of that is that since you can reduce something by -1, that may not seem like a lot, but it also kind of fixes that issue where it's like, there are going to be a lot of times in game where you may not have to use an additional card to reduce someone's cost before actually using a removal card. So overall, you're just getting to do what black was intended to do without just having to discard additional cards. And now there are actually more benefits to discarding cards and putting them into the trash. As a person who comes from a Yu-Gi-Oh background, I very much enjoy decks which utilize the graveyard or the trash. It just feels like a second hand to me, and it's something I really resonate with. This archetype also kind of brings some old cards into like a new center of playability, and we'll get into that. But our first new card is Manchuri. 1 cost 0k, active main, rest this, return 2 cards from the trash to the bottom of the deck, and then you can return a 3 to 5 cost character to your hand. Now, this is just an amazing effect. We've seen similar effects like this before, such as the starter deck Gecko Moria and how powerful that was. I mean, this card as well is giving you a card back of your choice in a pretty broad range, in my opinion. I think most of like Black's best cards have historically been 4 cost, and we actually have some new really strong 4 cost cards as well. So I think this card has a lot more optionality than you would think, and the ability for our leader to cycle every single turn really adds additional value to this card, and I like a lot of what it's doing.
Yeah, it's kind of like a 5th or 6th copy of Rebecca, as we're gonna get to there in a second. Just to be able to get her back and then get another thing back, and you kind of just snowball with her.
100%. You know, you think about this deck doesn't have nearly as many searchers as previous powerhouses, and instead of searchers, you're making up for that with additional copies of whatever your best card is, right? So,
right.
You know, that really goes a long way, and I think that's something that really doesn't seem as relevant on paper, but whenever you start playing the deck more and you understand that this deck is trying to play a slow game, that you're going to be able to cycle quite a few turns, and then at that point, it's almost like cycling becomes more of drawing a card without like a cost, you know, because like one thing we say in Magic is there's an effect called scry where you can look at the top card of your deck and you can either put it back on top or you can put it on bottom. And what a lot of people will say is that when you get to like turn 6 or 7, like a scry almost becomes equivalent to drawing a card, because some of the cards you're going to be drawing in the late game are just going to be dead. And it's like if you draw a really low costed card that's not relevant in the late game and you discard that to get a relevant one, then it kind of is just draw one for free because you had a dead card, right? And so that really adds additional value to some of these cards. But we've got the cornerstone of the deck, which is 4 cost, 0 power Rebecca. This card is a blocker, and on play, you can return a black character other than this card from the trash to your hand that is between 3 and 7 cost, and then you get to play a 3 or less cost character from your hand that is black, and that character comes into play rested. Now, this card has honestly added a new value to some old cards that really never got to see play. One of them being the Hina, which came out in, I believe, the Sakazuki starter deck. This is the 3 cost 5k, no counter. On play, give someone -4 during this turn. Now, what I've commonly been doing with Rebecca is I either add back Hina or I add back someone else, and then I play Hina. And I think that's one of the things you want to be doing more often with this card than not, because the character you're going to play from hand for free comes in rested. So you would really like it to be of higher power level if you can choose so. And since Hina is 5,000, I think it is really what you want to be doing in the deck. And being able to reduce someone's cost by -4, that is a lot, you know, because now I'm paying to create 2 bodies for 4, and then I'm also reducing their guy by 4. It's almost like I got to use the 4 cost Kuzan and activate the minus ability on play, you know, in some ways.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the deck previously was lacking, because a lot of times the 4 cost Kuzan was one of your best cards because it was the best form of reduction. And Rebecca kind of takes that to the next level.
Yeah, you don't rely on Kuzan so much because, you know, Kuzan's kind of a remove on sight, you know, assuming that he's just going to make your removal better. But Now you don't have that of waiting a turn to see if it stays around. You get to play it on your turn, get that effect. And that's why like I always prefer on-play effects versus, when attacking effects. Because you get it immediately. You don't have to wait. Yes, when attacking effects, you can reoccur, but as soon as that character goes rested, a good player's going to try and get rid of it.
Very good point. And I think we're seeing a shift in the game where at the beginning of the game, I don't think on-play effects were nearly as needed. But now I think we're at a point where since removal is just so good, you need most of your cards to be providing value on the front end. And then if they provide value on the back end, cool. But you don't want to be getting no value on the front end because then the other guy is getting more of an advantage for his removal. And I think that plays a lot into what I was saying about in the early stages, how beneficial a 1-for-1 trade was. Because in a lot of cards at that point in time, you stopped them from accruing any value. If I try to do a 1-for-1 trade on your Rebecca, then I'm still going negative because you still got to add back to hand and you got the tempo advantage. So it's like, I'm not stopping you from doing anything. You've already gotten most of the value immediately. And so it becomes really weird to interact with that card. And I think Moncherie and Rebecca play very well with the next card, the 4-cost 6K Rob Luchi. I think that this is the best card out of the set. If I had to choose one, I think this card is insanely power creep. And apparently people are calling the Sakazuki build, which runs Rob Luchi, Sakaluchi. And I guess some people were saying that previously people didn't find out that you should be playing this card. Like, I don't know, why the fuck would you just like read this card and not assume that this should be in every single black deck? Like, how do you even play the deck without this card? It's literally so broken. So on play, you can place 3 cards from your trash on the bottom of the deck, KO 1 2 or less character and 1 1 or less character. And with all of the cost reductions we have available, this card is basically just a +2 on site.
Yeah, and how it reads with Sakazuki too is remove 2/2 costs or a 3 and a 1. Because you're getting that +1 with your leader. So, I mean, especially like if we had this card in OP4 without all that stuff, like Zoro and Law would have been in trouble.
I would probably cite this card as being the reason that people are saying that red is dead is because you finally have an early game answer to the other player flooding the board with 1 and 2 cost searchers or just 3,000 power vanillas, where one big thing that we've been lacking in this game is just straight up AoEs. The only real AoE in the game is the 10 cost Kaido, but I don't know how...
Fire Fist too.
But Fire Fist is also a 2-for-2.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, but in Zoro, is it really a 2-for-2 when you're like, Buggy, grab this, you have such a big hand. It feels, it is a 2-for-2, but sometimes it does feel like a 2-for-1. But this is a true 2-for-2.
In order to get the
2-for-1,
the 2-for-1 with Fire Fist, though, you actually have to do some work because you need to get a +1 beforehand to make that a fair exchange of value. I think similarly to Belo Betty, any card that reads you need to place cards from the trash on the bottom of the deck, just disregard that text. And if the effect is good, it's just a card you should have in your deck. And I think that rule can be applied very well here because the leader ability essentially mitigates any cost that is associated with putting cards on the bottom of the deck. Another big thing here that they fixed previously in the CP package was that you had to return specifically CP cards to the bottom of the deck, which honestly, this should have just been the case since like that mechanic came out. Because I think that with a lower level of consistency compared to other games which actually have hard searches for specific cards, I don't think that mechanics that rely on specific cards in the trash are just going to work well in general. Because I don't think we're at the point in the game where it's as easy to manipulate what types of cards get put in the trash And I just don't think that's a good way to be going about the game. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get you on that. But yeah, this card's pretty dumb, dude. I'm excited to play it. I'm not excited to play against it.
100%. And the reason why I say this card works really well with the previous ones we talked about is because you can essentially think about your Rebecca and your Moncherie as 8 additional copies of Rob Luchi, as this is probably the best card in your deck. Imagine you were at 8 Dawn, you play Rebecca, you add back Rob Luchi, you play Hina from hand, then you reduce their guy by -4, attack with your leader, reduce someone by -1. Well, now you're going to be able to kill 2 things that one of them could be 6, the other one could be 3, or something like that. Whatever way you're going to manipulate it. That's just such an insane amount of tempo that you're generating off of these cards, and it plays really well with all the other cards we have.
Yeah.
You can kind of disregard the text where it's like he said, you could just be 2/2 costs or 3 costs and a 1 cost. You could also just manipulate that in so many ways with how many low-costed cards that reduce something are in the game. One big picture idea here is that, like I said, there's a lot of blankets in the game in terms of 2Ks in most decks outside of red, and Rob Luchi really alleviates some of that pain, making cards like Tashigi and Suru cards that previously you really didn't want to have to use those to reduce their guy if you could afford not to, because your removal already costed you discarding a card. Well, now with that alleviated, and with Rob Luchi already being a 2-for-1, I think that you're going to be playing out these 2Ks a lot more often than you previously did. And then we also have the new bomb in the deck, one of the new bombs, 7-cost Borsellino for 8,000 power on play. Play someone with a cost of 4 or less on the bottom. I mean, it's just a generally good card. Not much to say here. I think this card works really well with your 2Ks, and as well, it can work really well with your Hina, or there's another modifier you can play that some people don't play.
Fist Eruption.
Yeah, Great Eruption.
Yeah.
That's a really good card to play there. I mean, these new cards have added a new value to Great Eruption, and as well, we see some people playing Ice Age. But overall, Borsellino, just a good rate in general.
Yeah. Have you seen, I think it's Ice Age that has a really weird, good trigger, but it's just KO'd one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 3 or less. Okay, so it's not as crazy as I thought.
I think you're talking about the one where there's a black card that's really weird, but if you trigger it, the guy discards a card, I think.
Maybe. It's one that's just man, I wish I could get that trigger. I would just swap the effects, and this card's 10 times better. But
it's something you normally can't gain access to, and that's kind of what black does. Also, we have the 10-cost Kaido, another 10-cost Kaido, or is the one that came out last set, is that 9?
No, it's 10 costs.
Okay, yeah. So now there's a second 10-cost blue Kaido with 12,000 always. Someone pointed this out to me recently. I guess anyone who is a Yonko is supposed to be 12K.
Yeah, because, spoiler alerts, I don't know if people care. Mute me for 10 seconds. But the Gear 5 Luffy he's a 4 Emperors. In which he's never been that before. But now he has the 10-12 stat line.
Okay, that's tough. I mean, the more you know. But on play, if your opponent has 3 or less life, draw 4 cards. Honestly, I don't know how many implications this card has. In my opinion, I don't think that you should really be playing this card. I could be wrong. It's just when you're a deck that's trying to accrue value and you're trying to take into the late game, you're going to be getting 2-for-1s more often than your opponent. Do you really need to just take a turn off in a tempo-based game to draw 4 cards? I think for the most part, you should be the one who's up on cards.
No, I agree. I don't think it fit. It might fit in certain blue decks, but I just don't think it has a home in Sakazuki. I like the idea of drawing 4 cards. That sounds tight. Do I think it fits in every deck? Absolutely not. Do I think it's an auto-include in some decks? Absolutely not. Do I want to just draw 4 cards? Absolutely.
Yeah. No, but it's also conditionally draw 4 cards.
Right. You have to be chipping them, like chip them enough,
Yeah, it's almost like you need to be the aggressor. And I don't think that you can really be that aggressive in this deck with so many people. You have like your Rebecca and your Moncherie being, and all your reducers too, outside of Hina, are just cards you want to play in the field, but also are not good attackers.
Yeah, and I think here's part of the problem with building Sakazuki, and I think why people had trouble with it. It's a toolbox deck, You can see stuff more often. You don't have to be as consistent as running 4 of 4 of 4 of 4 of 4 of, because there's really 4 cards you should be playing 4 ofs, and that's Rebecca, Rob Luchi, and probably Hina. And the rest of them can vary a little bit depending on your meta, depending on what you're going to see. Sakazuki just has so much from the 2 colors, and they work so well together that you can make you can just make it a toolbox deck that's a good enough toolbox deck to can compete.
100%. Our last new card here, which really glues the deck together, is the new 2-cost event Hound Blaze. Main, one of your leaders or characters gets plus 2k this turn. Then you can place a 2-cost or less on the bottom of the deck with trigger, return 1 character of a cost of 3 or less to the owner's hand. I mean, this is just an amazing card.
Yeah, I mean, your leader goes to 8, and say your opponent just played a 3-drop, you're at 8k and they have something rested, you swing, well, and I guess you have to swing first to minus, but essentially you can make this a 2-for-1, You play it, now maybe you can't. Okay, it's a little awkward with the when you attack, you have to minus something, but there's a way, I've seen it done, this can be a 2-for-1. And if not, it can just be bottom deck, that 3-drop you just played on curve, and now I'm hitting you for 8.
100%. What you're paying and what you're getting for this card is just amazing. But what I will say, you kind of hit it on this. In my games recently, I've also found this is an amazing card. You always want to have it, but it does put you in some awkward spots where it's like, I think to get the most value out of this card, you want to have Rob Luchi. Because you need to have, honestly, if you want to get the most value out of any card in this deck, you want to have Rob Luchi.
Yeah.
But the reason I'm saying that is because, like he was saying, when you attack, well, I most likely want to give the power to my leader. But if I'm going to bottom deck something with this effect, and I want it to be reduced beforehand, I need to attack with my leader first. So this card adds a lot of optionality, a lot of depth to the gameplay, which I am a fan of, because now you need to choose, do I want to attack first? Do I want to play this first? But if you have Rob Luchi, then you can kill one low-costed thing, and then you can also reduce something else with your leader, and then maybe target that with Rob Luchi, or if you have like a Borsellino. You want to pair this with another card that allows you to bottom deck, but yeah. I mean, overall, not that much to say about this card. It is also a Navy keyword card, which is very nice because it pairs well with the Poverty Searcher, known as Brand New. This card, I hate this card. Anytime I look at this card, I just feel bad for people who play black because, like, why the fuck is this in the game? Why does this cost 2? Why is this the same cost as Curly to Dan, except the search specifications are very much more restricted, and then you also only get to see 3 cards. Like, honestly, I would say you could just argue for not putting this in the deck, but I mean, it's an okay card.
Yeah, I guess if you feel like you need to play Rob Luchi on curve and you need to get cards out fast enough, you have to put 3 down, so it's fine. I think you could cut it. You could probably cut it for something like Sanji's Pilaf,
True. I mean, yeah. That's definitely one of the variables in the deck. Not a bad card. I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's funny. But big picture thoughts here. The biggest thing that to me that stands out with this deck is that previously with black, outside of all the other issues that we just named, to me, it was always the age-old question of all of the only good cards in black have no counter. And so you really had to kind of like even out the scales with how many non-counter cards can I afford to play with this deck and actually get away with it. with the ability to now cycle every single turn, you can play as many non-counter cards as you want. And I think that really just helps out black as a whole, and in some ways blue.
Yeah, for sure. And like these two colors, like they work so well together. Because like one of the awkward things about black, and I'm not going to go too long on this, is like the mirror match is so awkward. Because you're like, okay, I wanted to kill your thing, but I also have these things that can't be destroyed. It's like, well, blue solves that problem. It's just like, just bottom deck it. And it cares about the cost usually. So like having a cost reduction to bottom decking, it's really cool, I think. And that's why I think these two colors just work really well with each other.
I kind of like how they didn't really introduce any new cards that said your stuff can't be KO'd by effects, because I'm just not that big of a fan of that mechanic. I think it's one of those things where like later down the line, we are going to appreciate that as being like an identity of one key color, because it's going to just become more polarizing over time. Like throughout the history of this game so far, it's been kind of like the thing where red's identity is just to be able to remove your guy with a card. And in my opinion, that shouldn't be a part of the identity for one color or be considered a mechanic. That's just called removal. And that should be available in every single deck. And so for the same regard, on the other side of the coin, I don't like cards that just say, this card can't be KO'd if it's also just a good card. Like, for example, Sabo, if he didn't have that effect, he's still just a good card. Just on-rate card. And adding that additional benefit down the road when every color just has access to KO this card, I'm glad that we're not getting more of those effects too quickly, because I think that could be a problem very fast if they just kept printing every good card in black to have that effect, right?
Yeah, and then it would just make, if black got better with those effects, it would just make blue that much more valuable because it'd be the only color that could get around it.
Yeah, it would kind of make black win more, right? But moving on to our next deck, we have Yellow Enel, which from my research at the beginning of the format, it seemed like most people anticipated this to be the best deck. And I think as people started to understand more about the cards and the metagame really started to shape up, this deck seems like it's lost a bit of popularity. I think we've actually seen quite a bit of people recently returning to the yellow Katakuri strategy, but nonetheless, we are entering what I would consider a triangle format. In general, your purple Luffy deck is going to beat Yellow Enel. Yellow Enel is going to beat Sakazuki, and Sakazuki is going to beat Purple Luffy. I have a strong resonance to triangle formats because I just feel like I've had the most fun in card games typically when it was a triangle format, because you've got that versatility, that, rock, paper, scissors element where it's like there are multiple decks you can actually customize and justifiably say this is the best deck in the room, where you can't always say that in other metas. Like, if you got to play in Asia and you got to play full power Boat Beard, then you're just like, I'm playing Boat, or I'm playing Rob Luchi to counter the guy with the boat. And it's like, would you rather have a format like that, or would you have a triangle format? I think typically triangle formats tend to be the most balanced in my experience,
Yeah, because how much room is there at the top? Because everybody's like, oh, I want every deck to be viable. And it just doesn't happen, And I agree. I like triangle formats a lot because, and in One Piece especially, like this one, you have yellow, purple, blue, black. Those are all colors that have never been on top, because if we have had this triangle format before, it's been with 3 red decks, Yeah,
and I wouldn't...
Law, Zoro, Whitebeard.
I wouldn't even necessarily consider that a triangle format, because those decks are sharing the same cards. You know what I'm saying?
Right. No, yeah. Some people could consider that, but it's just this. There's so much overlap.
I think that this is also very fun for the reason being that we haven't really had a triangle format in this game in general yet.
Yeah.
So it's honestly just a new layer to playing the game. And I think that this type of meta structure works very well for a game like this that's going to be best of one.
Yeah, I agree.
But overall, I think that when most people saw this deck, they immediately thought that this was going to be busted. And if you thought that, you were right. I don't know if you had this misconception, but when this was first revealed, I thought that you didn't have to discard a card. So this guy says once per turn on your opponent's turn, if you hit 0 life, you get to add a life card from the top of your deck to your life, and then you discard a card from your hand. I thought that you just didn't discard. I thought you just got a life every turn.
Yeah, I think it was a bad translation. And it was just like, dude, what? Yeah, and it's the first monocolor leader that's at 4 life. At 4 life, it's gonna be at 5, maybe 6, but NL is just a really cool leader. I think it's gonna require a little more skill than the yellow players are used to, because they're used to just like, I'm gonna swing for 7. Is that a beige? No, I'll leave it on top. Okay, oh, you hit it. I'm going to play my, Parasparrow and then just flood the board from you hitting me. And then just, typical Katakuri stuff. But this one's going to take a little more. And there's really 2 packages I've seen online. You can play the Skypiea Big Mom Pirates package, or you can play a more Big Mom package variant. So I do like that there's some versatility in the deck building of this deck.
And on that note about the yellow players, just want to give a huge shout out to the guy who got permabanned, then unbanned, then permabanned again for turning his Katakuri life cards the opposite direction so he could know if he was hitting a trigger. Haha, fuck you, buddy. You can't do that with an L anymore. You can no longer look at your life cards when playing yellow. I'm really excited for that because I think yellow in general, just the core mechanics, just being trigger happy, you could say, like that's the only good thing about yellow is it's like you have the best triggers, you have the most of them. Well, you have less opportunities to manipulate that with this deck being probably the best yellow leader, and that's something I'm super excited for because I just think it lowers the interaction of the game when that's a core mechanic, and I think this is more true to what yellow should really be about.
I agree. It's not just like, I'm going to just play stuff for free on my life and wait to drop Big Mom on you,
For sure. Because like the point of a trigger is it's supposed to be an unexpected turn of events that can change the game. And when you were just cycling through your life, essentially, guaranteeing that you're going to summon a character during their turn, it's basically just putting the tag rush on your cards that shouldn't have rush, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of unfair. But this deck, it didn't actually get that many new cards, which is kind of interesting. And I think that really puts the light on how power creep this leader ability is with there not being that many new cards. And in general, when I look at the yellow card pool, and in the past when people would try to tell me that Big Mom is the better leader. Good thing we have the basement door closed so that Mike's wife can't hear me because she's a Big Mom player. Anytime someone would say that was like the better deck or I want to play black, yellow, Big Mom, I feel like there's not a lot of incentives to play any other yellow leader until we got this guy because it's like the entire focal point of yellow is to use these triggers and maximize them, and you could just maximize the triggers in a different aspect, like on a different level than any other yellow deck, right?
Yeah. I mean, what made Katakuri so good is just Worn Dawn was 2. Swing for 7 for Worn Dawn.
True.
And you get to just a little bit, there. It's just...
Because what I would say is that what makes Katakuri good is if you're playing yellow, what makes yellow good in general, if you could guarantee that you're going to summon a 5k character in your first or second life, you're probably winning that game. And the Katakuri ability, in addition to the plus 1000, is pretty much as close as you're going to get to that in a game with limited consistency. But this guy, I mean, he just takes it to a different realm. I'm excited to see a new way to play the game. I think that in order to get over that hump of being for life, you realistically want to stump your opponent on not killing you while you're at 1 at least 2 turns. That way, you're making up for the loss of 1 card. Similarly to how we talked about with Law, how you really want to get at least 2 additional searches out of your leader ability so that you can make up for that lost card. I think that's going to be a big focal point for Enel, and I think that puts a large emphasis on utilizing blockers in this deck. Mm-hmm. The list we're looking at here does not contain all of the new cards, from my understanding. I could be wrong, but I know that...
It's missing the Searcher.
Okay. I haven't played the build that Mike's talking about, where you play the Skypiea Searcher, I guess. But the build that we're looking at and what I've been playing is considered the holy build. And the first card we're going to look at is Ohm, a 4-cost 5k. On play, look at the top 5, reveal a holy card, which is a 3-cost 5k vanilla, and then you can play 1 holy card from your hand. Important thing to note here is you do not have to add the card to play the card. So if you already have the dog, you can just put the dog onto the field. And as well, if you were at 2 or less life, this guy constantly has plus 1000 power, similar to a Charlotte Cracker effect. This card is amazing. I don't think you could play the deck without this. Like, I personally wouldn't. Apparently some people don't.
There's the heavier Big Mom package. Then they don't cut. The only Sky Island card they run is the Freak Out guy.
Okay.
That looks at both lives. Is Yamato. Yamato without recovering.
Do people still play this card without the dog in that build or no?
No, they just don't play him at all.
So in general, I would prefer to play this card. I just think that when we talk about the vanilla stat line rates of 4 cost, if you can get 6,000 power and an effect, you are in good standing. And the fact that most of the time you're going to be able to manipulate your life to be able to go down to 2, that also having a counter with potential upside really goes a long way. So, and this card has done a lot for me. And I don't think it's bad to be playing a 3-cost 5k in your deck. Because for me personally, when I played Katakuri, I played 4 copies of Peckham's because I found it very important, since we're playing a deck that's focused on getting to the late game and using our powerful high-costed bombs. I don't want to miss a drop in the first 2 turns of the game. So in a deck like this, even without an effect like Ohm to play our dog here for free, I would still like to include a card that can be played at this point in the curve anyway. So That's why I really value this card, Ohm, so highly, is for that reason that we're already feeling a point in the curve, but you can choose not to play that if you want. Do whatever you want, but if you don't win, you heard it right here on Beatsbyash's channel.
I'm not saying to run the Big Mom package or the other one. I'm just saying it's out there,
Yeah, sure.
I think the dog and Ohm are sick because, whereas like Ulti and Page 1 have to be from hand. You can rip that Holy from the top deck, and then you've only lost 1 card in the hand and have 2 bodies.
Exactly. And also both of those cards have a counter, so there's no disadvantage there. And if it is dead in the late game, you could just discard it for your leader ability to replace the top life. So you're not really sacrificing much to include the package. But the next card is Gadatsu, 5-cost 6k with a counter, which is the premier stat line at 5 costs. So looking very nice on play. KO one of your opponent's characters with cost equal or less than their life. I will say that I think this card is going to be doing a lot more pull at the beginning of the format when people don't recognize you should be playing around this effect, because I think that if your opponent is playing around it, it can be difficult to accrue value from this. And with the stat line, it's not like you need to, get a lot of value with it, but it is preferred, right?
Yeah, and it's just like, against yellow is like late game. Your life, you're like, I better take this hit instead of just losing it as a card if they're going to trash it from a big mom in the next few turns. So like when you see them playing an L, you can just be like, I'm going to take the first 2 lives, which a lot of decks do that unless you're playing Purple Luffy or something like that. And then it can only pop a 3 cost. And you're like, well, it's rough on them. But if you're blocking hits early from an L, you're probably doing it wrong. Because you don't want this guy to pop a 5 drop, like that could be rough. So, and I know, kind of a opposite thing to that is like maybe if you're in L, you just don't swing the first few turns, leave them at 5 or 4, and it's like, okay, go ahead and play your leader or play your 4 drop or 5 drop, and I can pop it with this, and then I can start swinging and kind of take away that mid game tempo.
That's a very good point. I didn't really think about it specifically in that way, and what I will say is I think this card is a lot more narrow than it seems because, number one, people can play around it depending on what deck. It's also situational in certain matchups, like in the Purple Luffy matchup. The guy's going to take his own life, so you can't even control that with what Mike is saying. And that's also why I consider this to be a bad match. I consider this to be a good matchup for the Purple Luffy deck is cards like this that have diminishing returns. And this was actually the card that Mike noted is the only Skypiea card that people play in the other build that doesn't run the dog package. And I just don't see that that's worth as much as something like the Rob Luchi deck where I'm calling the Rob Luchi deck because it's the best card, but the Sakazuki deck where I'm playing 4 copies of Manchuri and Rebecca because I actually want additional copies of Rob Luchi as well as several other cards in that deck. I don't know that you want to play a Searcher to get additional copies of a card that already has narrow implications.
Yeah, it's going to be one of those cards you have 4 of in the deck, you play it once, you kill something, and then you never play the other 3 copies.
100%.
At best.
I wouldn't be surprised if you end up discarding a card if you discard a copy late game for your life.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because, the later it goes on, if they're not recovering, he doesn't really do anything. He could pop, a 1-drop blocker. Good job. I will say one card, I know we're talking about the new cards. One card that is insane in this deck is the 9-drop Yamato. Because you almost, going from, 1 life, taking that hit on your opponents and they can't do it on the next one, and then you go back up to 2, it's such a rat race, right?
And in order to use Yamato, do you have to kill one of their guys?
No.
You don't?
No, you just have to be at 1 or less life.
Okay, so you can actually just gain the life without KOing their character?
Yeah, it would be bolded and have a colon if it needed to do that beforehand, so...
Okay, yeah, no, I understand. That makes a lot more sense to why this card is good in the deck. I didn't know that. I haven't been playing it like that, but yeah, that adds a lot more value to why this leader ability is more powerful. Yamato is a very interesting one because we've seen this be one of the yellow cards that I think has a very level value across all level strategies, where for the most part, all other really high power level yellow cards have generally had a higher benefit when being played in Katakuri specifically, right?
Right.
So that's where Yamato, I see that as being a staple long term.
Sure.
The next card we have is the new 7-cost 7k Anel. This card has Rush, and once per turn, if this would die, you can trash the top card of your life instead, and because fuck it, if Monkey D. Luffy is on the field, this effect may not be activated.
Too much flavor, dude. I'm hoping that later in One Piece, so spoiler if you haven't gotten to Sky P or you don't care. Anyways, he ends up going to the moon. I want this man to come down from the moon and do a fucking wave check on everybody. Because you never see what's under the do-rag, and I want to see that wave check.
Ooh, that sounds tough. Honestly, this is kind of sad, but I've seen the Skypiea arc, and I didn't know that he went to the moon because the fight scene was just dragged out for 30 episodes.
well, they play in the manga. It's like in the beginning panels. It's like for 30 chapters, it shows him go to the moon.
Oh, okay.
Actually, there's a card in this set that references that. There's like a little dude, like a tauntaun from the moon.
Oh, holy shit!
And I was like, wow, that's a deep reference because it's like not in the main story. It's just like a glimpse at the beginning. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked.
But there are two parts to this card. Number one, this card can trigger its effect even if your opponent uses a blue card to put it on the bottom of the deck or return it to the hand, because it just says when it would be removed. So it has some more relevancy to the card. But in general, I think that this is honestly one of the lowest power level cards in this set. Still a good card, but in this list we're looking at, they're playing 3 copies. And I don't know that I would play more than 1 or 2 of this. I don't even really like this card because why does Monkey Luffy just fuck this card? It's like the worst matchup for this deck is already the purple Luffy deck. And then just by them having Monkey D. Luffy.
It has to be a character.
Oh, I thought they could just fuck you.
No, it has to be, it says character.
Okay.
I can't, if they just have the leader, they have to have the character.
Okay, never mind. This card is actually kind of good.
Yeah, which I mean, against red, but I think you run the 4-drop category over this one.
I just don't like the rate on this card. I don't like paying 7 for 7,000 power.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think you would run, if you need a rusher in the deck, just run the 4-drop category. He has no counter. He costs 4. And if you have less life, which you probably are in this deck, he has rush for 6k. So 1 more Dawn, he would be the same power, and you only paid 5. You have 2 more Dawn. That's a good point.
I 100% agree with you saying, especially because I think the correct way to play this deck is going to be to take the first 2 damage. I have a very good feeling of that, and I also think that cards like Thunderbolt you're going to want to maximize on because it also allows us to manipulate the effect of our own by putting ourselves to 2 or less life to gain the 1,000 power, and that works really well with
the 4-drop category.
Yeah, with the 4-drop category, because you have to have less life than the other guy, right?
To have rush.
Yeah. So that's going to be very easy to manipulate in this strategy because you're already going to want to be low. And I think it's something that other people aren't going to see coming. And considering this is honestly a mid-range deck, I think that you would rather have a 4-drop than the 7-drop. Overall, not that impressed. But we do have a very impressive card. One that really puts the deck together. I think this is Yellow's best event so far. 1 cost event, El Thor. Counter, give up to one of your leaders or characters plus 2,000 for this battle. If your opponent has 2 or less life, you get an additional plus 2,000 power. So if your opponent is at 2 or less life, this is a Radical Beam, and that has been proven to be very good. Radical Beam is currently at 1, and this has a trigger to KO one of your opponent's characters with cost equal or less to their life total.
I didn't see the trigger. I think that's one of the reasons they had to bring all the red cards off, because it's like, how awkward is that if Rad Beam stays on and then they print El Thor and they're like, it's kind of the same card. You have to get your opponent to 2 life, but if everybody's playing double color leaders, it might be easier than you think, or like Luffy.
Yep.
So,
I mean, also the trigger is actually pretty relevant. Because you can kill. I've played games where I killed the guy's Borsalino because he just attacked, and I'm just like, okay, trigger. It's just like another cheapo depot card,
Yeah.
You know what's interesting about this deck is it's like the Sakazuki matchup is supposed to be one of your better matchups. So because it's one of your better matchups, you have a trigger that specifically win more.
Yeah.
And because the purple Luffy deck is a losing matchup, you also just have cards such as the guy who's screaming, which is just a lose more card as well. So like this card is really polarizing very directions. I just kind of picked up on that, but I think that's pretty funny. Okay, yeah. There's also a 5 cost 5,000 power 2K that lets you trash a card on trigger to play this from hand. So this card is honestly going to be an inclusion in every yellow deck going forward, I assume. if you're not playing this Katakuri, like, what are you doing, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's another 5K you can get out of life. And if you don't get it out of life, then you have a 2K.
Yeah. I mean, I think this card is amazing. But I think it's really stupid. Why is this card not restricted to this deck type? Like, that's so degenerate. When I'm building Katakuri, my thought is I want to maximize on every card that's summoned from life and has 5,000 power. And then this is a 2K counter, so it doesn't take up one of your actual slots in the deck. It's a free slot.
You get to take out, like, Sanji, 2K counter for that, which is just, better. Because it has the trigger, and just, there's going to be a point where Katakuri is just going to be a deck with 2 bombs, 4 copies of each, and the rest, the whole deck, you're just like, I don't want to hit you because you're just going to play something from life.
100%. Big picture thoughts here. I think that this deck can do very well if there are a lot of people playing Sakazuki. I'm not too sure about how good the mirror match is. I think that, out of the new decks we're being presented, I'm assuming this is going to be one of the most skillless mirror matches out of the new decks. I mean, it's a yellow deck. What can you expect? And it's like you're in a back and forth battle of okay, I don't want to put you at 1. You don't want to put me at 1. Yeah. And now we're just actually stalemating. It's like the Eustace Kid mirror match all over again.
Yeah. Good old standoff where you just both build. It's like Magic when you both build a big board and you're like, all right, we can't swing into each other because the first one who swings in just dies, So it's going to kind of be like that.
Yeah, see, what I always like to say in Magic is I don't like playing against bad players in a draft because they don't understand how to break a stalemate. And when you get to a point where it's I have 5 guys, you have 5 guys, and then it's beyond repair. Yeah. But I'm always down to trade characters in the early portion of the game because I want to progress the game. Not because I think it's saying if it's an even exchange, I will just trade because I want the game to end. And I could see that getting out of hand very easily with a deck like this. Overall, I think that this deck is probably one of the less consistent decks, in my opinion, out of the new ones, just because you don't have any way to maximize your trigger abilities, and there are no real hard searchers. And also, I just think one of the things that kind of makes me not be as interested in this deck is it feels like a very linear strategy. The big point of this deck is you have strong on rate guys, and then you're getting potentially an additional life. I would just read this leader ability as you're starting with 6 life in the ideal scenario if you want that to happen, right? And then I'm playing an all vanilla deck, which I already want more intricacies to be added to the gameplay. I don't know if this deck really does that for me, but I do like Anel as a character, so for that reason, I think it's cool. I just don't it doesn't really stand out to me so far. Yeah. Maybe when I get tired of these other decks, maybe I will try it.
Yeah, I don't think I could have said it better than you just did right now, because when you were saying that, I was like, damn. Yeah, it is like that. For real, though. Bunch of vanillas.
I didn't think about it until now. I just read the card. I'm like, okay, why is this card good? It's a 2K that's summoned from life. Okay, why is this guy good? He literally adds a vanilla and then puts it all good. Well, why is he good himself? He gets plus 1,000 power, so he is a good vanilla. It's every single card in this deck. And you know why I don't like Anel? He's not a good vanilla.
No, he's a bad vanilla. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's really all you can say about this deck.
Yeah.
We got 2 more decks for you guys. All right, Mike, it's your turn to talk about some purple Luffy.
So we got one of the menaces of the format. I think a lot of people are excited about this leader in particular. Is the purple Luffy. So when I first read this card, I'm like, eh. And then I was like, wait a minute. This is you want Onigashima to ramp, and you can just do that in leader. So his effect is, you may add up to 1 card from your life cards to your hand. If the amount of Dawn on the field is 0 or 3 or more, add up to 1 Dawn card from your Dawn deck as active. So it's not coming in rested, it's coming in active. So all of a sudden, your turn 2, where you have 4 Dawn, you have 5 Dawn. So you're switching your curve from even to odd with this leader. And depending on some matchups, you might never do this. You might do it once and you might do it twice. But just getting up to like some numbers for some of these new cards and some of the old cards, because the majority of this deck is just like structure deck cards. You have stuff like 9-drop Kaido, which has always just been a crazy card, on play, kill something 6 or less, and then it has rush. So a lot of times it can be a 2-for-1. You have Queen, which is it has that Marco stat line. You have X-Drake, you have ulti because you want to go wide. It's playing some crazy purple cards like Poly. Like when people started adding Poly to the deck, I was like, please make the stock of Poly go up. So the first, I won't say it's like a new card, but it's new enough, is one of the Eustace Captain Kids from the 3 Captains deck. So he has a on play and when attacking effect. You can -1 Dawn to give your leader plus 1,000 till the start of your next turn. So you essentially become a Whitebeard and stuff like that. And with this leader, if you're going second, you can play this turn 3.
You can technically play it turn 3 if you go first as well. You just ramp on 2 and then ramp on 3.
That's right. And that's crazy. Like going like turn 3, playing an 8-drop that can make your leader an 8-beat, like a Whitebeard. I don't know if you always want to do this on play.
That's one of the big debates I've been having is I'm not sure that it's correct to use the ability on play every time. But what I will say is I do believe this is the best card in the deck. I've seen some people only play 3 copies. I think I want to play against you because I'm going to clap you up if you're only playing 3 copies. Some people have a misconception that they think you need to like draw the 9-drop Kaido to win the game. I think this is the most important card in the deck. Think about it like this. You're starting with 3 life essentially because in most games you will ramp turn 2, turn 3. Obviously there are going to be exceptions to the rule, but if you think about it as you starting at 3 life, then getting the additional 1k is very important. Yeah. And if you're able to put out 2 of these, I think it's very difficult for the other guy to actually like have any effect on the game because you think about why the Whitebeard leader was good. It's because if they want to attack your leader, he is 1,000 more, so they're taxed. But typically those people outside of searchers, all of their characters they played were also 6,000 power for the same reason that they have no good attacks. And so with that in mind, if you have a captain kit on board and you followed up with another one, use the effect on attack as well as on play, well, now your opponent has to pay 2 to attack your leader, but they also don't have a good attack on your character because they would have to pay 3 to attack your character. And I think that's a very like overlooked aspect. I'm sure some people like subliminally done this, but I don't think they've really understood why that's very strong.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it is right to do this on play 100% of the time if you had dropped the 5-drop kid like the turn earlier. And especially if you get like 2 of those late game, when you get your 2 Dom per turn, and you just keep sitting in the back and you have to deal with a 7k leader and 2 8ks. Like,
oh, that's broken.
Yeah, you scoop up your cards and you go to the next opponent. So the next card is another Eustace Captain Kid. This one actually comes from the set. He's a blocker, costs 5, has 6, 1k. That's that Marco stat line. Your turn, once per turn, when a Dawn card on the field is returned to your Dawn deck, add 1 Dawn back as active. So this just lets you play purple with no downside, Like it's just such an enabler.
The effect, the big picture here is the Dawn is set as active, and I would argue that this effect could be considered less of my purple cards have no cost, and more so my purple cards ramp me a Dawn. Because typically this is going to be most applicable if you are at like the 8 to 10 Dawn interval. In order to do the play Mike's talking about to where you go kid into kid, you're only going to be able to do that going second because then you'll be at 5 on 2. But if you're going first and you go 1, 4, 7, 10, then at that point, you're not going to be able to play this on 2 you play your 7-drop on 3. So earliest you're going to play this on the play is turn 4. So you're already going to be at minimum 8 to 10 Dawn. And at that point, it doesn't matter that we're losing a Dawn. So setting the Dawn as active is entirely upside when you think about it like that. And you're going to come into a lot of situations where, from what I have experienced in the deck thus far, 9 out of 10 games, you will ramp turn 2 and turn 3. And past that point, even if you need the ramp, you really have to think about the opportunity cost there, because the cost of going from 3 to 2 life is very, very high. And so effects like this are very important, because if you already use 2 negative Dawn effects, you might be at 9 instead of 10 Dawn. Best example, you already have the 7 cost kid on board. You play down this guy, and then you use the 7 cost kids effect, then that puts you from 9 to 10. So now you are able to play another 5-drop when you couldn't afford to actually play 2 5-drops.
Right.
Because you didn't want to use your leader ability. And that's something that comes up quite a bit. So I find this effect or ramp to be entirely upside. And there are even some turns where you are going to use this as a ramp, and then you're going to leader ramp. And that's fucking disgusting.
Yeah, just getting to those bigger numbers quicker than everybody. So your mid game is 7-9 instead of, 5-6. It's just, that's what I felt like Purple wanted to do at the beginning of this game. And then it didn't, because you had Kaido, who had Onigashima, but you had no way to go and grab it from the deck other than a mulligan.
This should have been the first Purple starter deck, let's be real.
It might have been too good.
We're toning down the cards a little bit, but this is what we wanted,
Yeah, the 2 kids do make it, huge upside. But I think if this Luffy would have been in the structure deck, Purple would have been a lot more relevant throughout the metas. So we have another card from the structure deck. The Trafalgar Law. It's a 4-drop, 1k counter, 5,000 power, has a block, is a blocker. In on play, you minus a Dawn. If your opponent has 7 more cards in hand, they have to discard 2. They don't get to choose. It's random. So I've walked in this trap a lot recently of playing at locals and forgetting that this is even a card because it's so new. And people are just get rid of 2 cards. And I'm like, you bitch. So it can be frustrating, but I know some Purple Luffy decks do a split, or they do one or the other, and they run the film just because I guess afraid of wide strategies getting to you. I could see that, where this is more of a Sakazuki hand eater versus, if you have something like Inal or another Purple Luffy, if you have that ulti, you can stop them from going wide a little bit.
To me, this is a mandatory 4 of in the deck. And my reason being is, when we look at the decks in the meta, what decks actually have a turn 1 play? I guess Sakazuki, if they're going to play brand new, and even then that's replacing a card in their hand. And so a big tip here is, if you are on the play and on your second turn, you attack with your leader and your opponent takes the first hit, because generally speaking, most leaders want to take the first hit unless they played a card from their hand on their turn 1. They will be at 7 cards, which means you can trigger this ability as early as turn 2. You may not want to do that in every matchup, but the fact that you can just do that off the bat is just straight up degenerate, in my opinion.
Yeah, you got rid of a life and 2 cards. That's huge tempo. And it's almost all the time, I think it's worth that Dawn, but some situations it's not. And also, as a 5k, it can attack with no Dawn investment into most leaders. So it's a very good card, for sure. And I agree with you. I would go 4 on this, other than this in a split with ulti, just because, even late game, it could be relevant. So we got one more leader, right? I think we covered everything in this, unless you got anything more that you want to add.
One other thing I want to note is, I personally am not that big of a fan of red purple Luffy. When I read the red purple Luffy and I realized you have to be at 8 Dawn to use the ability, and then I was shown this card, I was like, what the fuck? Why are these cards printed so close in terms of their release date? And why is that card even a card?
It's because you have access to red and purple. And it's like you're like a half beard. It's like you're not taking the life, you're just 6K with 3. I think they just wanted to print it just to have it as like check mark for the design. We have a 6K leader with 3 life. There we go. Done.
So in your opinion, is that like anywhere near this card in power level? Because I've seen some people really liking red purple Luffy, and I know some people are playing it right now in America while the ban list is still in effect. It's like, is that even that good? I could see how it could be good now, but in set 5, I don't see how that is even comparable to this, because
this is so much better.
Like, it's unconditional. The other guy is conditional. And also, it just goes back to what one of the main themes we've talked about today is. With Sakazuki, they just actually made a well-designed 2-color leader with there being good cards that are navy type in both colors. Once again, I don't think there are that many red cards that you want to use in a ramp deck. Because the way that I explained it to someone is it's like, okay, the big advantage to red in the card pool currently is you have some of the best early game threats in the game. But when you're playing a ramp deck, you don't want to be using removal even if it's Dawn efficient on their guys. You want to be playing a ramp card. And when that leader specifically cannot ramp until later in the game, it's even more pivotal for you to be using a ramp card at that early stage in the game. And so that's where it's just like, it's too conditional. This card is just unconditional. And we talk about why this deck is good without searchers. It's because you're doing the same thing every single time. You are not reliant on drawing a specific card. The 9-cost Kaido is very impressive. You don't need it to win. I think that you would like to have the 7-cost kid out of any card in the deck. Once again, don't need it to win, because cheating out a fat guy 2 turns earlier than you legally should be able to is still very oppressive, no matter what skin you put on it, right?
Yeah, and also if you think about this as a 3-life leader and you have the 7-cost kid, then you become a 6K leader at some point, and you also see 2 more cards that Luffy doesn't.
True, and those 2 more cards get you closer to guaranteeing a 7-drop, or even more specifically, the 7-drop kid. I mean, overall, this is kind of our top pick for the set. We kind of hated on Red Purple Luffy. I will say that's a notable deck. And as well, I guess the last thing that we'll touch on is the only real winner from this set outside of like Green Purple Dofi, which I'm not sure is like, is that a competitive deck even?
People will try. Does it have legs? Sure. I think it's a good deck, but it's going to lose to Luffy because by the time you're like 7K go wide, they already have 7-drop kid. And like the problem with purple or grape Dofi is like you have no removal. You are a very defensive board control deck. You have no removal unless you play 9-drop Kaido. I don't know why the fuck anybody ever plays 9-drop Kaido in that deck, because it's just like you lose 5 Dawn that you don't get back as fast as other
But
purple.
hey man, they have the weaklings that deserve to die. It's the best removal in the game.
It is a good removal. I don't know if you can play it in that deck because it's like you don't have the space. You want to run the other events because you just want to be blocking 7Ks, 8Ks. And I think it's just gonna fall between the cracks just because the other decks have better removal and they're just faster. Like if you put out Nami, cool. Sakazuki's gonna kill that ASAP. All they have to do is like swing with Sakazuki -1, play a Hound Blaze, it's gone. They don't have to think about it. Purple Luffy, they have Poly. They can just not care because they're too fast. And it's like, okay, and I don't know about it now. I think you could play it, but I don't think it's as good.
You know what's funny about you saying it's bad versus Purple Luffy? One of the only games I played in the sim so far, the other day, the guy played Birdcage on me. And Birdcage is honestly a really broken card. Basically, it's just a bomb. I think that is a really well-designed card, and I'd like to see more cards like that. So essentially you pay 5, and then people who are 5 or less don't become unrested during the end step of your opponent's turn. And when you get to 10 Dawn, it kills everyone who is rested in 5 or less. But the thing is, I had 2 back-to-back Magellans, so I was just trolling the guy. Like, I had other action to make that were just better, but I had a guy tapped, and I was kind of baiting him, and I would just tap my guys on purpose, and then when he would get to the turn where he could birdcage and kill my guys, I would just Magellan and reduce it. And then the other end of that is, if I tap my Magellan and he kills it with the birdcage, then he's forced to return 2 Dawn. Yeah. So it's kind of just a double edge, like, fuck you. But I think one common theme we've seen from the rogue decks this set is that rogue decks are just randomly good against Sakazuki.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny.
Sakazuki's a meta eater, but like if you have some meta decks, they can just deal with it.
But on to this last deck, we're going to talk about Zoro, which kind of got some small improvements from this set. I guess the most noteworthy one is this 10 cost Luffy.
This card's insane. Have you had this played against you?
No.
It feels bad. I was playing Dofi like the week after that deck released, and I had 2 blockers, and they just played this, and I was like, oh, I lose because, you know, if I block this hit, it's just like either way, he's going to get rid of like 2 blockers because I didn't have enough to counter out the 11. And it was just, yeah, this card's stupid.
I honestly didn't even know that this was in the starter deck. I thought it came out of set 5, but it's 10 cost for 11k power. Once per turn, when your opponent activates blocker, you can KO 1 character with 8,000 or less power this turn. I mean, this card is just really strong, especially with Purple Luffy in the meta, because now you are getting the most value out of this card as possible. Most likely, this card is going to like want to kill something like the 7 cost Kid. I think if you do that, you just auto win. But there's just a lot of good targets in the Purple Luffy deck in general. So overall, it's going to be a big role player. The thing I've been most impressed with about this deck is I think we're seeing a resurgence to the 5 cost Rush Luffy in this meta, because I think against Purple Luffy, Rush Luffy is insane. This card just says, fuck you, screw the rules. Because you really want to be playing all the cards in your hand. You want to be using all your Dawn every turn, double spelling in the late game, and then if you're leaving your characters untapped, they're going to have to hit your leader. And if you're swinging with a 7 cost Kid, they're going to have to hit your leader because that's 8,000. So then you're going to be low no matter what. And I've gotten into situations where someone stole the game because I played double blocker and then have 3 cards in hand. And the guy just goes 10 Dawn, play Monkey D. Luffy, attack game.
Yeah. I mean, this card's always been good. I don't know if it will ever be like bad per se. And then I would hate to see like the card that replaces that.
I've also seen some people who are playing the new Fire Fist Revolutionary event, which we talked about before, and think this is a good addition to the deck because it lowers your curve, and it also just requires you to have less things going for you, because previously with Fire Fist, it's like you had to use Buggy to find something for it to be like an even exchange of value, and also Fire Fist just adds more value to your reducers that you already wanted to play or cards you were on the fence of. So for me personally, I stopped playing Otama a long time ago because I felt like it was just negative like card advantage. But with Fire Fist, I think you can make a higher justification to cards like that being good again or worthwhile. Cards like Blamenko, that was one where it's like you might be able to throw this in the deck if you're playing Izo. And now like since that's like a cherry on the top of that card, it's just additional value. Not sure how many you'll play going forward, but with Buggy in the game, you've always wanted to play a high event package. Right. And I think that's going to be replacing one of the other events you would play going forward.
I agree.
To end things off, personally, I think Purple Luffy is probably going to be either the best deck or Sakazuki. I think I'm going to be playing Purple Luffy. It's just the deck that I'm most like attracted to right now. And then I'd like to play Sakazuki at some point, but I think until I go up against like a bunch of people who are bad at locals, and because they can't win with anything else, they all swap to Monkey D. Luffy at the same time, then I'm going to enjoy the deck a lot.
Yeah, you win those mirrors, man. Yeah, I'm excited for Sakazuki because I liked playing decks with a lot of options and a lot of answers, a lot of variety. So I think that it just speaks to me a lot.
You're just saying that because you have a Navy hat.
Damn it, I didn't wear the hat in this video, man.
You dirty bastard.
No, Sakazuki's one of my favorite characters too. He's such a good villain. Like, not as in like, he's a good guy. Like, he is a villain and he does villain shit well. I respect the man.
I wouldn't be surprised if Sakazuki is the best deck, just because you have the most play potential, the most chance to affect the game, and I think the most like opportunity to customize the deck since you have the highest quality of overall cards with the highest access to cards, right?
Right. I'd agree. I think Purple Luffy is still just like, it's one of those decks that will just get you. You're like, oh, I'm a good matchup. I'll beat them, right? And then they just see everything they need to see, and you just, one turn, you get off tempo and you're done,
100%. But that's been our thoughts on the OP05 meta. If you guys have any questions, anything that you agree with or disagree with about our takes on these decks, or would like to see us discuss another option in a future video, make sure to let us know down below in the comments. And where can the people find you other than your basement, Mike?
It's Loading TCG. I'm on YouTube. I do One Piece stuff similar to this. It's mostly just commentary. Go ahead and hop over there. If you liked what I said, I'll say more dumb shit over there.
Sweet. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. Hope you guys gained a lot of value from this heading into OP05. And make sure to subscribe to his channel and as well to this channel. And as always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?